Well, I'd like to welcome you to Road to the White House, the MOOC, and the online course that I'm teaching this particular semester at Pace University. I'm David Caputo, professor of political science. And I have to tell you that today and this lecture and several lectures thereafter, I'm going to be talking about something that most people find interesting to talk about, and most people have very strong opinions about. And that's a whole question about the role of money in politics. Okay? And whether or not, and what should be that role of money, and what is that role of money. So today, I want to talk specifically a little bit more in the abstract, a little more philosophically in terms of the role of money, and ask you a question. And that is, in your opinion, what do you think should be the role of money in campaign? Should all candidates have equal amounts? Should candidates be limited in what they can spend or how they can spend the funds? Should candidates be limited in terms of who they get contributions from and the basis for that contribution? So when you start talking about campaign finance in the United States, there are several things that you need to understand from the beginning. First of all, campaigns are exceedingly expensive. Not just because of the personnel that you have to hire, not just because of the technology that you're responsible for, but largely because of what you need to do in terms of media advertising. Okay? The major television networks and the local affiliates do very well in election cycles because the number of ads that they run usually is a net plus to their revenue base. So first of all, money is very important for a campaign. Second thing is it's often difficult to understand what role money plays and how it plays. So I want to start with this first discussion, and that is, think of money as a resource. This is something that a candidate has or his supporters have, and they can decide how they want to spend that money. So they may decide on candidate A, candidate B, party A, party B, any number of ways. Okay? So the question is, should there be any kind of limits on what the individual is able to contribute, and so forth? Come back to that in a second. Second part, though, is money the only resource that's important during a campaign? And let's talk specifically about presidential campaigns. I mean, what about the fact that you might be able to generate a large number of volunteers who would come and work for you? Is that not an important resource? Should that be regulated? Okay. Or what if you're able to galvanize people to register and vote? Is that a resource also? So my point in raising this is that democratic theorists such as Robert Dahl in his preface to Democratic Theory argue that yes, money and personal wealth are very important in campaigns, but they can be offset to some extent. Some people would say no, but most of the theorists would argue they can be offset by other resources, such as numbers, such as the number of people who are willing to participate or volunteer, or the in-kind services that you might get. So for instance, if you're a not-for-profit organization and you want to support a candidate, maybe you have very limited money, but maybe you have a polling center, a phone center that can be turned into a polling center and used by the candidate. So that is a resource also. It's not direct money to money, but it is directly a resource that the candidate can use. So to make it, to try to bring some closure to this, because we could debate this, and I hope you will think about it, and that is the role of money and what should the role of money be. Okay? Certainly Senator Sanders is running a very aggressive campaign arguing that money and the role of big money in the U.S. election cycle really determines and rigs the system, the subsequent results. No matter who wins, they're in the pockets of big money. Therefore, big money is going to get their way when legislation has to be done, so forth and so on. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on. So what is at play here? Okay. Well, some people do disagree and argue that there should be limits, and relatively strict limits, on the amount of money people can participate. In the federal campaign legislation that's resulted over the years, and I'll come back and talk specifically about the 72, 74 legislation and then the bipartisan election legislation of the 90s, they put a limit on the amount of money that individuals could give to campaigns and so forth. So let's think about this for a moment. Should there be limitations on expenditures? In the various campaign reform legislation that took place, there were limitations put on expenditures. And in a famous Supreme Court case, so-called Buckley versus Vallejo case, the Supreme Court said that it did make sense to limit individual contributions. And that remains the law of the land. Now you're probably saying, wait a minute, what about Citizens United? Citizens United deals with a different type of organization, political action committees, so-called super PACs, and I'll come back and talk specifically about them. But for now, let's concentrate on what the individual limits are. So if you look at this particular table, this is a reprint from the Federal Election Commission, who's responsible for enforcing the various aspects. So as an individual, you're limited to $2,700 to each candidate or their candidate committee per election. Okay, $2,700. So that means if you wanted to write a check for the Sanders Presidential Election Committee, you're limited to $2,700. What happens if your check is for $3,000? They should return the money to you with a notation saying that you made a mistake and you can only give $2,700. You can see the amount you can give to the National Party Committee. So if you want to also donate to the Democratic Party Committee or the National Republican Party Committee, $33,400. And then to state, local, and district party committees per year, $10,000, and that's combined. So you can give $5,000 to the local Republican organization and maybe $5,000 to the state, but that is the end. You cannot give district, local, and state. You can only do $10,000 total. And then to any other political committee for a calendar year is $5,000. And if there's a political committee that's raising funds again on an issue or something, you're limited there. You can see what the National Party Committee can do. They can only give $5,000 to each candidate. So that means that the Democratic National Committee could only give $5,000 to the Sanders campaign or to the Clinton campaign in any election cycle. The state, district, and local party committee can give $5,000 to each candidate. A PAC, we'll leave the PACs out for now. An authorized campaign committee you can give $2,000 to. Okay? The authorized campaign committee, in other words, the re-elect John Kasich committee in Ohio could give itself $2,000 to the Kasich campaign. So you can see these are very real limits. When people argue, well, there's no limit on the amount of money that individuals can donate to politics, that is not true in terms of most individuals. It is true in terms of an individual who's going to self-finance themselves. Okay? So in the case of Donald Trump, he is not raising funds. He is funding his campaign himself. Okay? So the bulk of his funds are coming from his own personal wealth. So as you look across there, look at the various participants, however. The individual, National Party Committee, State, District, and Local Party Committee, the various PACs. Look at the amounts here. No limit as to what the National Party Committee can give to State, District, and Local Party Committee per calendar year. They can give $100,000 to them, and then that State and Local Party Committee, okay, can turn around and use that money to support candidates if they choose to. So this is what's so confusing for people. But the important point is, from your perspective, $2,700 is the amount, the total amount that you can give to a candidate per election. And in the primary process, that is determined as all one election. So you're very limited there. In terms of the National Party, the same. When you get into the fall, you can see the different things you can do. If you want to donate to the Democratic Party, you can donate up to $33,000 per calendar year. Now, what else does this tell you about campaign finance? It's very complicated. It's complicated for the individual. It's complicated for the organization. And it is also complicated for the Federal Election Commission to enforce. Basically, they respond to the various candidate filings, which are usually every 90 days, sometimes monthly, depending on where you are in the election cycle. So confusing to the individual. In other words, if I'm a well-to-do individual out in rural Texas and I decide, look, I really want to donate to Secretary Clinton's campaign, I'm prepared to write her a $100,000 check. Sorry, can't do it. You can write her a $2,700 check. However, there are other ways you might be able to get some of that money to her by funneling it to the National Party Committee or to state and district and so forth. So that it's important to remember that the individual limits are there, upheld by the Supreme Court. Some would argue that the court may decide at some point to take away all of those individual limits. But right now, that's the law of the land. So whether you're a billionaire, a millionaire, or an average person, these are the limits as to what you can do in terms of your individual contributions. We'll talk later about what about the political action committees and the so-called super PACs. Okay? So take a minute and just look at this particular table, study it, and you can decide for yourself if those are reasonable amounts or if it makes it difficult for the parties to have to go after much larger donations in terms of other contributors. So in closing this particular lecture, I'd just like to point out to you that if you're in favor of controlling contributions to parties, remember this has been in place now for over 30 years. And has it resulted in controlling the amount of money that the political parties and candidates are able to raise and how they raise it? I would argue what happens is every time you have a rule, it's like a Newtonian law, for every action there's a reaction. So if you pass legislation that limits something somewhere, it's not long before someone figures out a way to bypass that and come up with another thing that is, in most cases, turns out to be perfectly legal and also works. Okay? So bottom line question for you to think about too, should you want to control contributions? And two, if you do, how are you going to do it and will it be effective? Okay? So we'll come back to this next time when I talk about PACs and super PACs. Thank you.